I'd just like to take a moment to introduce our speakers today. First, I'm joined by Jacob Howell, Fernando Lopez, and myself, Rebecca Murphy. Jacob Howell is, many of you may know, Jacob is a telecom expert with 20 plus years of experience working with top wireless, wireline, and cable service providers. Jacob is also the global director of machine learning, robotic process automation, and innovation for Teoco Corporation. Jacob is also the secretary for CFCA. Welcome, Jacob, and thank you for speaking today. I'm also joined by Fernando Lopez of Fico. He is one of our lead telco fraud consultants. He specializes in telco ID proofing, authentication, and fraud management with Fico. And he is a proven identity, payments, financial crime, analytics, and risk management expert with strong global financial services. And lastly, myself, which is Rebecca Murphy. I am the telecom solutions leader for Fico. Been in the industry for about 23 years. So before we get started on the agenda, I just want to pause for a moment and recognize everything that is going on in the world today. The coronavirus has hit us all. Just wanted to share a few stats to kind of highlight how impacted we all have been. I think as of late, over 140 countries have been affected by the pandemic. 120 million Americans have been asked to stay at home. And I think we're all just kind of getting used to social distancing. So just like to sum it up by saying, I think we're all adjusting, whether that's working from home, helping others. Our hope is that you all stay safe, and we really appreciate you spending time with us today. So our agenda today is to talk a little bit about 4 different things. First, I'll be touching on the fraud life cycle. Then we'll turn it over to Jacob, who will talk about the most recent CFCA fraud survey. And then we'll transition to Fernando, who will be talking about the possible solutions for some of the trends we've been seeing and best practices. Next slide, please, Fernando. So this is a slide that many of us are familiar with. This is just intended to be representative of the fraud life cycle. Fraudsters have been hitting us at various stages of this life cycle for some time, and I think we're all used to that. I think, as I mentioned earlier about the pandemic, we're in unusual times. And so what we'll be doing today is Jacob will be talking about the most recent survey and where fraudsters have been hitting us. And Fernando will be talking again about possible solutions or best practices to help us through that. But what I'd like to highlight is we are definitely in unique times. And while we want to learn from the recent surveys, I think it's also important to understand that a lot has changed since the survey. And while many of us are staying at home, I think the fraudsters are probably more active than ever. So with that, I'll transition to the next slide and we'll turn it over to Jacob.
Hi,
Jacob?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, thank you.
Great, thanks for the opportunity to share with you the results of our latest fraud loss survey. This is a survey that we've been doing within the CFCA for at least I've been the lead author of it going back 13, 14 years, and it was going on for a long time before then too. And so a lot has changed, as you've said, over time. The latest headline number that we would share is, we're estimating total global fraud losses to be at a minimum 28.3 billion, and could be as high as 72.5 billion dollars based off of global telecom revenues of 1.625 trillion dollars. To put that into perspective, that is as much money as all of Samsung Corporation or Subaru makes in a year at a minimum, and as much as United Postal Service or even Intel or Panasonic make in a year as well. So we're talking about large dollar figures, large amount of money that businesses, or that carriers are losing as a result of fraud. Now, you may ask, why are there these two numbers here? The reason for that is because we've asked the question a couple of different ways, going back over the last 10 plus years. We asked our participants to tell us, looking out and what you see in the industry, what is your estimate of the global telecom fraud loss? And they would give a number in the 3 to 4% range. And then we asked the question again, okay, well, what are you seeing within your own business? What is the fraud loss amount compared to revenues in your own business? And we got a different number. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. And I highlight that because it's kind of hard to pin down exactly what the total fraud loss number is. I'm estimating it to be somewhere between these two lines. There's a couple reasons for this range. It's because, well, the nature of our industry has changed over the last 10 plus years. There's a lot of new products and services that are being offered. It's not just voice minutes that fraud departments are being asked to protect. There a lot of services being transitioned over voice. You've got now alternate service providers. You've got Viber. You've got WhatsApp, and a lot of things that don't pass through a traditional telecom network. Also, there is also a challenge in quantifying the dollar fraud losses. With fraud departments are now being asked to, protect the data network. And how do you quantify the dollar losses due to a data breach or something like that? And then I think there's also a little bit of protectionism, job protectionism as well. We've got some fraud managers, wanting to, show that, and justify their position if they are there. The fraud losses are much lower than what they would be otherwise if they were not there. Okay, if you would, please go to the next slide. So one of the questions that we've asked going back a long time as well is, what do you see trending within your business? Do you see fraud losses going up, down, or staying the same? And what we've seen with this latest survey is that there's a real separation. It's either going up or it's going down. And generally, people reported roughly 16% more reported that it was going up or staying the same within their business. So, clearly there's, like we saw on the last slide, there's a little uptick recently in the amount of fraud that businesses are experiencing. If you would go to the next slide. Okay, so we ask with each of our surveys, what do you see as an emerging fraud method within your business? Now, we ask about fraud methods and fraud types, and I'll just take a moment to describe what those are. A fraud method is how those fraudsters and organized crime gain access to the products and services that you in the networks that your businesses provide. And so that's a fraud method. And then once they've obtained that product or service, then how do they monetize that? That is what we call a fraud type. So we asked about the top 5 emerging fraud methods within your business. And the number one way that people are obtaining those services is through payment fraud. So using stolen credit cards, stolen checking account information, that type of information. Followed then by PBX hacking, and then abuse of network devices and configuration weaknesses of the network, account takeover, and IoT. This represents a shift from past surveys in that just this last one, there were a lot of concerns around phishing and farming, account takeover, subscription frauds, of both fictitious information on the applications as well as credit muling and proxy fraud based on real identities. So it's shifted now, but you can see there are account takeover, payment fraud. Those issues are still out there. The surprising thing is IoT. We just threw that question on at the last moment, asking what people were experiencing or concerned about around IoT, and surprisingly, it made it into the top 5 concern worldwide at 4.5% out of that total global telecom fraud loss number. That still represents a little over $1 billion that our industry estimates to be at risk due to fraud associated with IoT devices. In reality, what was actually reported is a little north of $300 million that our industry lost last year alone due to IoT devices, which I thought would be an interesting highlight to share here. All right, if we go to the next slide. Okay, so we talked about emerging fraud methods. These are the actual fraud methods that people reported that their businesses are struggling with. And the top one was subscription fraud associated with the applications that they're receiving, followed by payment fraud, PBX hacking, both traditional TDM-based PBX hacks as well as IP-based PBX hacks, and then Wangari fraud. Those are it's very easy for these fraudsters to blast millions of calls out onto a network in an attempt to get people to call them back and collect their personal information, or get them to call back to overseas number and collect those international settlement fees as well. So subscription fraud is a big issue. Okay, and then we also asked about bad debt within businesses, and traditionally carriers are very reluctant to admit that their bad debt, and a portion of that bad debt is related to fraud, but those attitudes are starting to shift. With this last survey, we saw several carriers report that indeed a growing amount of their bad debt was related to fraud. It almost doubled from what they had been reporting historically. So that is a growing issue, a growing concern across a lot of carriers, that there is a bit of bad debt related to fraud. Okay, I think that's all from my side. If there's any questions or concerns, you can ask them now or save them for the end.
Okay, and thanks, Jacob, for that informative session. Definitely a lot of that. A number of us in the industry are always await for this report and survey that you're spearheading and generating every 2 years, and it definitely echoes exactly what we're seeing in the industry and what we've collectively had with a number of conversations with the telcos out there, both not just here in the United States, but in Canada, South America, as well as the globe. Subscription fraud has always been the top of mind and the biggest risk and issue that everyone's tackling. And when we actually carve out to figure out what those issues are around subscription fraud, it can be easily divided between two, right? The third party and the first party fraud, where telcos have been the forerunners and the pioneers in being able to classify this type of fraud. Back when I was with the telco in the early 2000s, the telcos were actually the first ones to define it. Financial services were still at their infancy, just trying to figure out the issue. But what we've noticed over time, there's been a little bit of a little bit of complacency in the industry. People have been trying to redefine whose responsibility is what when dealing with third-party and first-party fraud. Third-party fraud being where the individuals actually there's a victim, like Jacob or Rebecca's ID is actually being used in order to secure that handset. And as Jacob mentioned, it's growing out from not just the services, but the handset and the equipment themselves. Where now it's a first-party fraud, where someone like myself, Fernando Lopez, I manipulate a little bit of my name and my credentials in order to secure that handset. Well, there's been a resurgence, definitely with a number of you that are leading the industry. There's been a resurgence in being able to tackle this issue, whether it's dealing it both from an analytic point of view by profiling individuals, identifying when it is a first pay default or early life default, is a never pay that happens within the first eight months of the subscription service can actually be defined as a first-party fraud, where organizations now, telcos, have enacted and been able to translate that into an actual strategy in order to address some of these issues that you see in front of you, whether it's the dealer that's involved, whether there's a revenue assurance leakage where someone's having some social engineering in order to facilitate trick with some trickery to allow the salesperson or the associate in order to give them that device. But what is starting to be also very apparent is that it's not just the loss itself, right? As Jacob mentioned earlier, bad debt has been a very good measure, and there's very much interest, but also telcos, as well as other in organizations that lend and subsidize a loan or financing for that product or services, are understanding that there's downstream effects that impact the business that can even make it even a much larger issue. They're understanding now that first-party fraud can be about 2 to even as bad as 8 times the losses when compared to third-party fraud losses. Where there now is even an impact to some of the operational efficiencies and costs, such as collections and the recoveries, or the way that you're actually trying to identify whether you should actually offer a loan to subsidize that handset, or the increased fraud risk exposure, or how much it's impeding your ability in order to generate revenue and actually issue those services, whether it's the handset or even new IoT devices. IoT devices. Well, telcos are now starting to see that there's other weaknesses. Even that information, the sheer amount of information that's out there on the web is easily attainable. 20 years ago, whether you went to a Carter's website or somewhere on the dark web, you were able to attain an ID for about $100. Well, now you can obtain 100 IDs for $10. And with all that information made available, it becomes easier for the individual to come into your corporate store or on the web in order to apply for those goods or services. But then and also maybe even to create synthetic IDs in order to use those IDs to build multiple IDs. And what we've seen, where they've taken actually one ID and manipulated it up to 12 times in order to access additional handsets and services. So it's even with things such as the cyber security score, we've been able to identify together with a number of telcos and even with the Chamber of Commerce, that it becomes even increasingly important for telcos to be aware of who you're working with. Some of your partners and distributors, how well they're maintaining that information, because they can also be a target for the fraudsters to be able to secure that information and also use that information to apply for those services. So it's always an reoccurring cyclical risk in order to maintain and protect the IDs and the individuals that you have a relationship with you today, but also identifying whether those are the true individuals that intend to pay and intend to honor the agreement with your services on an ongoing basis. Now, why this is much of an issue is that we're hearing from a lot of organizations that things that knowledge-based authentication, whether it's a KBA or a security verification question, it's starting to lose its luster and its strength. Things such as one-time passwords are also being weak. Device profiling is also at risk. Because we know that organizations such as Apple and Google, they'll be locking down their iOS to make it much more difficult for you, financial institutions, auto lenders, organizations as a whole, to be able to profile these individuals as they come to your door, because the uniqueness of their device, whether it's the handset or the laptop, is actually becoming obfuscated from the information. So you won't know if it's that individual associated with the transaction, the device that they're using. So it becomes really apparent that more organizations take and the telco industry take a much more aggressive steps in identifying what are the best practices in order to tackle this issue, and how to be able to adapt and scale as you try to introduce new products and services to try and touch more individuals. And even to, as Rebecca had mentioned, even to be able to touch and service those individuals in a very remote manner, but also at the same time securely identify who they are. So what we thought was actually just walking through with you some of the 7 best practices that we've identified in the industry, and then focus really on 2 specific ones that a number of your peers are actually leading the industry today here in the United States, where basically a lot of you are the envy with a number of the financial institutions and lenders in the industry on how to best implement these 2 specific best practices. So the first one is always being able to aggregate data. Let's face it, today there isn't one holy grail or one single solution to address the overall problem. It becomes extremely necessary that you have the right information, but information not just externally, but you do know a lot about that individual coming to your door and how they transact with you, and how you can turn that information to profile their pattern and cascade it across your entire portfolio for both existing and new clients. Secondly, it's critically important that you have the ability to authenticate correctly those individuals that come to your corporate site or your presence, whether it's at your physical store or even online, so that the type of strategy that you're using to do the authentication is easily adaptable and controllable by you as that organization, where you don't put the burden on your sales associates in order to determine and figure out whether this is the true individual. They can focus on the sale, and you can focus, and you as fraud leaders and executives can focus on the risk and be able to manipulate and manage that strategy over time, and even by channel and product. The third one is being able to leverage advanced fuzzy matching, being able to aggregate this data. I aggregate 1 and 2 in some of the best practices, and look at the results, figuring out what that profile looks like and the attributes related to that individual, whether it's the information on that subscription, the type of device that they're applying for, the channel that they're coming through, as well as the accessories that they might be asking for, and where they come from. Do they normally do these types of transactions or subscriptions at this particular time and on this particular day? And that's where analytic advancements such as predictive models become increasingly important, because they have the ability to be able to aggregate large amounts of data in a very quick and concise manner, where you're able to do that machine learning and able to aggregate and orchestrate both external and internal data into definitive results, but then also to have the predictive models to prioritize and profile these individuals as they're presented to you with that presented data, so that you know which ones to deal with and the severity or type of friction that you might need to apply for that individual in order to make sure that you determine that they're the true person that's applying for the services. Number 5 is then providing some more predictive nature. It's now taking another advanced step in doing that analytics, but doing it in a very correlation and aggregated way, where now you're taking networks of individuals and sharing not just the network at the entity level, but also at the attribute level, and figuring out what that bond and relationship is between the profiles of Fernando and Jacob and Rebecca as one example, and how the strength of those correlations that we share together. What has been very interesting is that when organizations actually have taken this step, not only have they been able to prevent and detect the losses at the subscription, but also at the post-book stage by clamping down on some of those services, identifying other patterns of continuous monitoring by continuously monitoring individuals that are coming through the door, but also even taking some of those accounts out of collections. As Jacob had mentioned, you know, they could be sitting in the bad debt because they have been testing your subscription process and your strategy, and sitting on your portfolio. Well, your collectors are trying to collect on those individuals. Well, what is definitely apparent is that you're trying to collect on individuals that would never pay, when you have the opportunity to remove them. And where we've seen in our studies, and also cases where we've implemented and helped organizations, we've seen an improvement in collections by much as 400%, because you're collecting on individuals who are true people that are willing to pay. Then most importantly, definitely one of the best practices is to be able to investigate smarter. Being able to have that appropriate workflow. As we're trying to systematically create results and create decisions in real time from 1 to 5, there's always the human factor to be able to investigate smarter, to be able to, for individuals and your associates, your fraud experts can easily update hot lists, make sure that this individual is put onto that blacklist, that ID proofing that identify that this ID is incorrect and that person does not match. Well, I want to be able to update it so that if that person comes into another store or through the web, that I have the means to actually block that individual and prevent them from applying for those services. Being able to aggregate cases and build better strengths so that you can update your fuzzy matching or your network analytic correlation, and generating a proper workflow where you can notify your sales associates, whether on the phone or at the store, that they should actually maybe allow that subscription to go through in a very timely manner, so that you don't lose the sale. Because as we know, the telco industry is becoming is extremely very competitive, and it becomes increasingly important who and how you get to that person is quick enough. And I can't stress it enough, you know, there's always the constant experimenting. This is definitely apparent when speaking with a number of you, of how you're constantly reviewing the performance of 1 to 6 and making those adjustments over time to make sure that they're calibrated and performing at the right level, and making those adjustments as you introduce new products, might actually introduce it into a new market where that's in need, and being able to adjust it based on season and revenue and risk appetite expectations. So of these definitely 7 best practices that have been resonating extremely well in the industry, what we wanted to do is actually focus on number 2, which is authentication and ID proofing, and number 5, which is network analytic correlation. And where a lot of organizations, your peers, are making investments today and developing very precise strategies on how to tackle with it, not only in the next a year from now, but in a matter of months. So the first one is ID proofing and authentication. The idea is to be able to have the ability where you can now authenticate that a person that comes to the door, not just by verifying the government ID that they present, whether it belongs to them, whether the ID is correct and has not been tampered or fabricated, and also have the ability to authenticate them, not just by corroborating the information associated with that ID and if it belongs to them, but also to have the means of authenticating them, and not just at a regular, what you know or what you have, but also to be able to do it in a biometric way or even a behavioral way, so that you can apply the right amount of friction based on the risk-based and evaluation associated with the transaction or the individual that's there. And the four things I'd like to stress here is that you have the scalability to be omnipresent, shared context in creating deep profiles, not just on the person, but also on the transaction and the event that's presented. And then also having the right smart decisions on knowing when to invoke it, what data that you might actually need in order to make the decision, because you don't need to pull from external data on a constant basis, whether it's a third party verifying an email address or third party verifying an IP address, where it might make sense to apply those basically on the type of risk of transaction that they're trying to apply, like the value of the device, the time of day that they're coming through, and therefore lowering the cost to your organization on acquiring that external data. And then also the AI-based authentication. It's managing both behavioral as well as biometric, and doing it in a very smart fashion, because you have now the ability to calculate many different variances, many different scenarios, and over many different data points, which we'll share with you in the next two slides. So the first one is ID proofing as part of that authentication up front. Here we have it's the ability to be able to proof of identity. We know that a number of you as telcos are now making decisive steps in order to look at the government ID that's being presented, identifying whether that ID is correct, whether it requires scanning or OCRing the information on the front and the back, determining the edges, determining the security features that are associated with it. It could be something such as a hologram or even RFID off of the passport. The best practice of part of this as well is doing ID corroboration in associating whether that ID actually belongs to the individual. So looking at a specific database, such as the state of Illinois or California, to verify whether that ID that was presented that had the Fernando Lopez on the driver's license actually does belong to Fernando Lopez with that driver's license number. And even looking at other third-party partners in verifying whether that might be belonging on a blacklist, or doing comparisons on the attributes that might be associated with it. And then the third one with ID proofing is the proof of possession. We see this as definitely the most advancement, which a number of you actually are striving for, and even some financial institutions and auto lenders as well. It's being able now to, as I've presented that picture ID, whether it's the passport or the driver's license, it's to extracting the photo from the ID to verify that it hasn't been tampered. It's also doing a facial recognition by taking a selfie or a picture of the person that's in front of you and looking for the liveliness, and then comparing the picture with the ID itself in order to bind. So now we're talking about what you have and what you know and bringing that information together. And these are definitely the three critical steps that have been the objective for identity proofing. Now, when it comes to identity proofing and authentication, there are layers controls there is the ability and sensitivity of when to do what type of friction. We've seen success in this, in applying this in a very frictionless way, being very intuitive for both the sales associate as well as the customer in order to manage it, so that you can apply this not just at the time that the person is being subscribed to and onboarding, but also even continuously throughout the life cycle, whether it's applying for an existing client for applying for additional services, changing a plan, or maybe even making a promissory note in collections. And then also applying artificial intelligence as part of this ID proofing, both at a behavioral, biometric, and multi-factor authentication. So the biometric, as we talked earlier, is that facial and voice recognition, being able to bind the individual as they're coming on board at the time that they're doing their subscription or on an ongoing basis. When we look at biometric, it is also bringing artificial intelligence to look at the different pinpoints within the face, where now it doesn't need to be a raw picture information that might require an individual to actually do the analysis, but now to systematically do that comparison, to look at the different characteristics with AI, to figure out with deep learning whether the picture presented does match, so that you can actually then maybe even offer your cellular services or a new mobile upgrade by just the individual presenting their face in order to do that type of analysis. Multi-factor capabilities are always still very much in the need and warranted, where you can do a challenge process above and beyond the biometric and the facial recognition, where you can send one-time passwords, some question challenge responses, as well as tokens associated with your application, or back down to the individual to verify that they are who they are and what the services that they're asking for. And the last one, which is extremely interesting, is the behavioral capabilities, which our organizations are making advancements in. They understand that there are certain keystroke or behavioral ways that an individual might present themselves when doing shopping on your site. How quick they are into doing some comparisons. Where did they shop at in the past? How fast did they actually enter some of the information in the subscription, so that you can find out whether there's a bot actually filling out the subscription application in order to secure multiple variations, to see how they can actually automate that process so that they can secure as many handsets as they can. Well, this is where AI also becomes increasingly important, where now you can do that manipulation and figure out, well, how quick, why did it take an individual so quick in order to do their shopping? Did they shop here before? Are they using the same ID? Should I apply more friction? Should I ask for them to present their face and their ID again in order to confirm who they are? And this is where behavioral authentication becomes extremely important. So as we finish off talking about ID and ID proofing and authentication, the second one, the best practice that wanted to also have focus on, is around network analytics and identity resolution. The reason why this is becoming, and it has become extremely important, is because today, a number of you probably do have a great team that actually create those correlations, but do it very much on a very manual way. They're looking at spreadsheets and manipulating data to find linkages based on hotspots of individuals that might be, walking into one of your corporate stores in Kansas or into New York, or even online in order to apply for those services. Well, the organizations are looking for a much more automated way, because they know that the sophistication of fraud is going to increase. And why not focus your experts and your resources on those much more challenging cases, when you can generate these entity resolution linkages in a much more systematic and automated way, so that you can really boil up those high-risk cases to the very top, so that they can be dealt with in a very quick action, so that the device or the sale can be completed, or additional friction and triage needs to happen. And this is where identity resolution becomes extremely powerful, because not only can you see this in a very single customer view, in a very predictive graphical analytics of how individuals presented, not just a snapshot at this point in time, but over time on how that network can grow, so that you can see potentially a bust out attack, or look at investigations, but apply this both at the time of the subscription, or even on ongoing continuous monitoring, so that you can invoke a real-time strategy the minute that you've identified the issue or the risk that is presented. And even bringing in data where you don't need the huge investment of being able to of creating mirror databases, but connecting into databases as you need it on demand in order to present that network diagram. So here you can see that this one organization was able to link certain cases together. What this actually meant for them was that they identified over a specific time that there is actually one particular network of subscriptions that came in at this juncture. And they've identified within this juncture some certain applications that shared devices, that shared commonalities of the information, and were applying for high risk services, and at the same time identified which ones that may be sitting collections that share the same attributes, such as device, that should be taken out of the collection bucket, so that you don't need to collect on them. And you can write off immediately. And what this does is that every new application or subscription that comes through, it now gives the ability for the organization to take a very decisive step in order to determine instantaneously that they shouldn't allow the subscription to go through, or they should apply additional more friction by asking additional identity documents. Ask for corroboration for the information that it is correct, in order to determine whether they allow it to let it go, or even give just enough friction for the fraudster to go away. And when we look at this all this topology, it becomes increasingly important is how do we piece them together in order to deliver the right value, as well as automate it as part of your process flow. So as we look at this, we see that every point has to play within that authentication, identity proofing, as well as network corroboration, where information as it's presented through, we see the number one best practice of acquiring that data. We see the ability of authenticating them at the top tier and doing the ID proofing. We see the ability also of bringing the analytics within the decision management platform or subscription fraud, in order to invoke both the fuzzy matching, your decision strategies, as well as the analytics, and then bringing the network correlations, whether it's through identity network, or analytic workflows, to be able to provide that investigation to update hot listings and respond back in communication back to the sales teams or to the individual that's applying for the services, whether you need additional information and what information you would need to allow it to process through. Now, as a summary, we do think that with these best practices, we can see a number of different benefits back down to your organization. Definitely, it's the seamless experience with digital onboarding. It's actually reducing some of the costs for the acquisition. It's allowing you to make a decision in a very timely manner, so that you can still recognize revenue with the minimal costs expected. It's also looking at stopping things such as fraud and identity theft, because you have the ability to identify who that person is. It's going back to your regulators and auditors to be able to say that you're applying the right KYC and red flags to identify that this is the true individual coming to your door, and also bringing the ability to have that continuous monitoring, looking for the clusters of that individual, looking for the clusters of the organized fraud that might be perpetrating the fraud within a specific region, so that you can identify whether you need to investigate sooner or actually block the transaction. And when you look at all four, determine whether you can actually let the application to go through with a greater degree of confidence.